Hi, today we're going to deal with Fathers and Sons, chapters 6 and 7. Now, I want you to be very aware of the visual images presented in the first part of chapter 6. The intent is to continue the development of the antagonism between Bazarov and Pavel. Bazarov, who's just returned from collecting frogs in the marshes, is extremely dirty, soiled, and of course that's contrasted with this immaculately clean and precisely dressed Pavel. So the sight of this filthy Bazarov entering the house is repulsive to this fastidious man. The argument between Paul and Bazarov is the result of their basic views. Pavel dislikes Bazarov's lack of patriotism in paying too much homage to German scientists and not enough to the Russians. Bazarov likes the Germans because they're scientific and rational, and they're far superior to the Russians on this count. So each interaction between the two reveals how set and determined both Pavel and Bazarov are. And this also adds for some of the conflict, but sometimes some of the amusement as well. There's been nothing in Pavel's past life that enables him to understand Bazarov's point of view. Pavel's always accepted the value of art and music. And when he hears a young man saying that art is meaningless, he practically loses his cool and becomes very angry. Nikolai, like Pavel's, also disturbed, but he doesn't react as violently against the young people because he recognizes that the world is changing and even admits that maybe young people are kind of cleverer. So when Bazarov later begins to attack Pavel as useless and aristocratic, Arkady tries to defend Pavel by narrating and explaining his uncle's background. Arkady wants Bazarov to feel some compassion for Pavel, trying to explain why Pavel's developed into the type of person that he is now. Notice how Turgenev is interfering in his story by addressing the reader directly, telling him or her that the reader will find Pavel's story in the next chapter. And so in chapter 6, the main narrative is again interrupted in order to go back and tell the story of the lives of one of the characters. So that's what chapter 7 is going to do. It's going to tell the story of Pavel's life. We're going to learn what a dashing young man he was, but we also understand that because of a woman, or more specifically because of a woman's rejection of him, he suffered a great deal in his earlier life. This information becomes pretty important because later on, Bazarov is going to have a little bit of a problem with a woman as well, and it's going to throw him for a real loop. Okay, here we go. Let's look at chapter 6 and 7 of Fathers and Sons. Enjoy.
Bazarov came back, sat down to the table, and began hastily drinking tea. The two brothers looked at him in silence, while Arkady stealthily watched first his father and then his uncle. "Did you walk far from here?" Nikolai Petrovich asked at last. "Where you've a little swamp near the aspen wood. I started some half-dozen snipe. You might slaughter them, Arkady." "Aren't you a sportsman, then?" "No." "Is your special study physics?" Pavel Petrovich in his turn inquired. "Physics, yes, and natural science in general. They say the Teutons of late have had great success in that line." "Yes, the Germans are our teachers in it," Bazarov answered carelessly. The word Teutons instead of Germans Pavel Petrovich had used with ironical intention. No one noticed it, however. "Have you such a high opinion of the Germans?" said Pavel Petrovich with exaggerated courtesy. He was beginning to feel a secret irritation. His aristocratic nature was revolted by Bazarov's absolute nonchalance. This surgeon's son was not only not overawed, he even gave abrupt and indifferent answers, and in the tone of his voice there was something churlish, almost insolent. "The scientific men there are a clever lot." Ah. To be sure, of Russian scientific men you have not such a flattering opinion, I dare say." "That is very likely." "That's very praiseworthy self-abnegation," Pavel Petrovich declared, drawing himself up and throwing his head back. "But how is this? Arkady Nikolaevich was telling us just now that you accept no authority. Don't you believe in them? And how am I accepting them? What am I to believe in? They tell me the truth. I agree. That's all." "And do all Germans tell the truth?" said Pavel Petrovich, and his face assumed an expression as unsympathetic, as remote, as if he had withdrawn to some cloudy height. "Not all," replied Bazarov with a short yawn. He obviously did not care to continue the discussion. Pavel Petrovich glanced at Arkady, as though he would say to him, Your friend's polite, I must say. For my own part, he began again, not without some effort, I am so unregenerate as not to like Germans. Russian Germans I am not speaking of now. We all know what sort of creatures they are. But even German Germans are not to my liking. In former days there were some here and there. They had, well, Schiller, to be sure, Goethe. My brother, he takes a particularly favorable view of them, but now they have all turned chemists and materialists. A good chemist is 20 times as useful as any poet, broke in Bazarov. Oh, indeed, commented Pavel Petrovitch. And as though falling asleep, he faintly raised his eyebrows. You don't acknowledge art, then, I suppose. The art of making money or of advertising pills, cried Bazarov with a contemptuous laugh. Ah, you are pleased to jest, I see. You reject all that, no doubt. Granted. Then you believe in science only. I've already explained to you that I don't believe in anything. And what is science? Science in the abstract? There are sciences as there are trades and crafts, but abstract science doesn't exist at all. Very good. Well, and in regard to the other traditions accepted in human conduct, do you maintain the same negative attitude? What's this? An examination? Asked Bazarov. Pavel Petrovitch turned slightly pale. Nikolai Petrovitch thought it his duty to interpose in the conversation. We will converse on this subject with you more in detail someday, dear Yevgeny Vasilyevich. We will hear your views and express our own. For my own part, I am heartily glad you are studying the natural sciences. I have heard that Liebig has made some wonderful discoveries in the amelioration of soils. You can be of assistance to me in my agricultural labors. You can give me some useful advice. I am at your service, Nikolai Petrovitch. But Liebig's miles over our heads. One has first to learn the ABC and then begin to read. And we haven't set eyes on the alphabet yet. You are certainly a nihilist, I see that, thought Nikolai Petrovitch. Still, you will allow me to apply to you on occasion, he added aloud. And now, I fancy, brother, it's time for us to be going to have a talk with the bailiff. Pavel Petrovitch got up from his seat. Yes, he said, without looking at anyone. It's a misfortune to live 5 years in a country like this, far from mighty intellects. You turn into a fool directly. You may try not to forget what you've been taught, but in a snap, they'll prove all that's rubbish and tell you that sensible men have nothing more to do with such foolishness, and that you, if you please, are an antiquated old fogey. What's to be done? Young people, of course, are cleverer than we are. Pavel Petrovitch turned slowly on his heels and slowly walked away. Nikolai Petrovitch went after him. Is he always like that? Bazarov coolly inquired of Arkady directly the door had closed behind the two brothers. I must say, Yevgeny, you weren't nice to him, remarked Arkady. You have hurt his feelings. Well, am I going to consider them, these provincial aristocrats? Why, it's all vanity, dandy habits, fatuity. He should have continued his career in Petersburg if that's his bent. But there, enough of him. I found a rather rare species of a water beetle, Dytiscus marginatus. Do you know it? I will show you. I promised to tell you his story, began Arkady. The story of the beetle. Come, don't, Yevgeny. The story of my uncle. You will see he's not the sort of man you fancy. He deserves pity rather than ridicule. I don't dispute it, but why are you worrying over him? One ought to be just, Yevgeny. How does that follow? Well, listen. And Arkady told him his uncle's story. The reader will find it in the following chapter.
Let's learn about Pavel.
Chapter 7. Pavel Petrovitch Kirsanov was educated first at home, like his younger brother, and afterward in the Corps of Pages. From childhood, he was distinguished by remarkable beauty. Moreover, he was self-confident, somewhat ironical, and had a rather biting humor. He could not fail to please. He began to be seen everywhere. Directly, he had received his commission as an officer. He was much admired in society, and he indulged every whim, even every caprice and every folly, and gave himself airs. But that, too, was attractive in him. Women went out of their senses over him. Men called him a coxcomb and were secretly jealous of him. He lived, as has been related already, in the same apartments as his brother, whom he loved sincerely, though he was not at all like him. Nikolai Petrovitch was a little lame. He had small, pleasing features of a rather melancholy cast, small black eyes, and thin, soft hair. He liked being lazy, but he also liked reading, and was timid in society. Pavel Petrovitch did not spend a single evening at home, prided himself on his ease and audacity. He was just bringing gymnastics into fashion among young men in society. and had read in all some 5 or 6 French books. At 28, he was already a captain. A brilliant career awaited him. Suddenly, everything was changed. At that time, there was sometimes seen in Petersburg society a woman who has even yet not been forgotten. Princess R. She had a well-educated, well-bred, but rather stupid husband and no children. She used suddenly to go abroad and suddenly return to Russia and led an eccentric life in general. She had the reputation of being a frivolous coquette, abandoned herself eagerly to every sort of pleasure, danced to exhaustion, laughed and jested with young men whom she received in the dim light of her drawing room before dinner. While at night she wept and prayed, found no peace in anything, and often paced her room till morning, wringing her hands in anguish, or sat, pale and chill, over a psalter. Day came, and she was transformed again into a grand lady. Again she went out, laughed, chattered, and simply flung herself headlong into anything which could afford her the slightest distraction. She was marvelously well proportioned. Her hair, colored like gold and heavy as gold, hung below her knees. But no one would have called her a beauty. In her whole face, the only good point was her eyes, and even her eyes were not good. They were gray and not large, but their glance was swift and deep, unconcerned to the point of audacity, and thoughtful to the point of melancholy, an enigmatic glance. There was a light of something extraordinary in them, even while her tongue was lisping the emptiest of inanities. She dressed with elaborate care. Pavel Petrovitch met her at a ball, danced a mazurka with her, in the course of which she did not utter a single rational word, and fell passionately in love with her. Being accustomed to make conquests, in this instance too he soon attained his object. But his easy success did not damp his ardor. On the contrary, he was in still more torturing, still closer bondage to this woman, in whom, even at the very moment when she surrendered herself utterly, there seemed always something still mysterious and unattainable, to which none could penetrate. What was hidden in that soul? God knows. It seemed as though she were in the power of mysterious forces, incomprehensible even to herself. They seemed to play on her at will. Her intellect was not powerful enough to master their caprices. Her whole behavior presented a series of inconsistencies. The only letters which could have awakened her husband's just suspicions she wrote to a man who was almost a stranger to her, whilst her love had always an element of melancholy. With a man she had chosen as a lover, she ceased to laugh and to jest. She listened to him and gazed at him with a look of bewilderment. Sometimes, for the most part suddenly, this bewilderment passed into a chill horror. Her face took a wild, death-like expression. She locked herself up in her bedroom, and her maid, putting her ear to the keyhole, could hear her smothered sobs. More than once, as he went home after a tender interview, Kirsanov felt within him that heart-rending, bitter vexation which follows on a total failure. "What more do I want?" he asked himself, while his heart was heavy. He once gave her a ring with a sphinx engraved on the stone. "What is that?" she asked. "A sphinx?" "Yes," he answered. "And that sphinx is you." "I?" she queried, and slowly raising her enigmatical glance upon him. "Do you know that's awfully flattering?" she added with a meaningless smile, while her eyes still kept the same strange look. Pavel Petrovitch suffered even while the Princess R loved him. But when she grew cold to him, and that happened rather quickly, he almost went out of his mind. He was on the rack, and he was jealous. He gave her no peace, followed her about everywhere. She grew sick of his pursuit of her, and she went abroad. He resigned his commission in spite of the entreaties of his friends and the exhortations of his superiors, and followed the princess. 4 years he spent in foreign countries, at one time pursuing her, at another time intentionally losing sight of her. He was ashamed of himself. He was disgusted with his own lack of spirit, but nothing availed. Her image, that incomprehensible, almost meaningless and bewitching image, was deeply rooted in his heart. At Baden, he once more regained his old footing with her. It seemed as though she had never loved him so passionately. But in a month, it was all at an end. The flame flickered up for the last time and went out forever. Foreseeing inevitable separation, he wanted at least to remain her friend, as though friendship with such a woman was possible. She secretly left Baden, and from that time steadily avoided Kirsanov. He returned to Russia and tried to live his former life again, but he could not get back into the old groove. He wandered from place to place like a man possessed. He still went into society. He still retained the habits of a man of the world. He could boast of 2 or 3 fresh conquests, but he no longer expected anything much of himself or of others, and he undertook nothing. He grew old and gray, spending all his evenings at the club, jaundiced and bored, and arguing in bachelor society became a necessity for him. A bad sign, as we all know. Marriage, of course, he did not even think of. 10 years passed in this way. They passed by, colorless and fruitless, and quickly, fearfully quickly. Nowhere does time fly past as in Russia. In prison, they say it flies even faster. One day at dinner at the club, Pavel Petrovitch heard of the death of the Princess R. She had died at Paris in a state bordering on insanity. He got up from the table, and a long time he paced about the rooms of the club, or stood stock still near the card players. But he did not go home earlier than usual. Some time later, he received a packet addressed to him. In it was the ring he had given the princess. She had drawn lines in the shape of a cross over the Sphinx and sent him word that the solution of the enigma was the cross. This had happened at the beginning of the year 1848, at the very time when Nikolai Petrovitch came to Petersburg after the loss of his wife. Pavel Petrovitch had scarcely seen his brother since the latter had settled in the country. The marriage of Nikolai Petrovitch had coincided with the very first days of Pavel Petrovitch's acquaintance with the princess. When he came back from abroad, he had gone to him with the intention of staying a couple of months with him, in sympathetic enjoyment of his happiness. But he had only succeeded in standing a week of it. The difference in the positions of the 2 brothers was too great. In 1848, this difference had grown less. Nikolai Petrovitch had lost his wife. Pavel Petrovitch had lost his memories. After the death of the princess, he tried not to think of her. But to Nikolai, there remained the sense of a well-spent life. His son was growing up under his eyes. Pavel, on the contrary, a solitary bachelor, was entering upon that indefinite twilight period of regrets that are akin to hopes, and hopes that are akin to regrets, when youth is over, while old age has not yet come. This time was harder for Pavel Petrovitch than for another man. In losing his past, he lost everything. "I will not invite you to Marino now," Nikolai Petrovitch said to him one day. He had called his property by that name in honor of his wife. "You were dull there in my dear wife's time, and now I think you would be bored to death." "I was stupid and fidgety then," answered Pavel Petrovitch. "Since then I have grown quieter, if not wiser. On the contrary, now, if you will let me, I am ready to settle with you for good." For all answer, Nikolai Petrovitch embraced him. But a year and a half passed after this conversation before Pavel Petrovitch made up his mind to carry out his intention. When he was once settled in the country, however, he did not leave it, even during the 3 winters which Nikolai Petrovitch spent in Petersburg with his son. He began to read, chiefly English. He arranged his whole life, roughly speaking, in the English style, rarely saw the neighbors, and only went out to the election of marshals, where he was generally silent, only occasionally annoying and alarming landowners of the old school by his liberal sallies, and not associating with the representatives of the younger generation. Both the latter and the former considered him stuck up, and both parties respected him for his fine aristocratic manners, for his reputation for successes in love, for the fact that he was very well dressed and always stayed in the best room in the best hotel, and for the fact that he generally dined well and had once even dined with Wellington at Louis Philippe's table. For the fact that he always took everywhere with him a real silver dressing case and a portable bath. For the fact that he always smelt of some exceptionally good form scent. For the fact that he played whist in masterly fashion and always lost. And lastly, they respected him also for his incorruptible honesty. Ladies considered him enchantingly romantic, but he did not cultivate ladies' acquaintance. "So you see, Yevgeny," observed Arkady as he finished his story, "how unjustly you judge of my uncle. To say nothing of his having more than once helped my father out of difficulties, given him all his money. The property, perhaps you don't know, wasn't divided. He's glad to help anyone. Among other things, he always sticks up for the peasants. It's true, when he talks to them, he frowns and sniffs eau de cologne. His nerves, no doubt, put in Bazarov. Perhaps, but his heart is very good, and he's far from being stupid. What useful advice he has given me especially in regard to relations with women. Ha! A scalded dog fears cold water, we know that. In short, continued Arkady, he's profoundly unhappy, believe me. It's a sin to despise him. And who does despise him? Retorted Bazarov. Still, I must say that a fellow who stakes his whole life on one card, a woman's love, and when that card fails, turns sour and lets himself go till he's fit for nothing, is not a man, but a male. You say he's unhappy. You ought to know best. To be sure, he's not got rid of all his fads. I'm convinced he solemnly imagines himself a superior creature because he reads that wretched Galignani and once a month saves a peasant from a flogging. But remember his education, the age in which he grew up, observed Arkady. Education, broke in Bazarov. Every man must educate himself, just as I've done, for instance. And as for the age, why should I depend on it? Let it rather depend on me. No, my dear fellow, that's all shallowness, want of backbone. And what stuff it all is about these mysterious relations between a man and woman. We physiologists know what these relations are. You study the anatomy of the eye. Where does the enigmatical glance you talk about come in there? That's all romantic, nonsensical, aesthetic rot. We had much better go and look at the beetle. And the two friends went off to Bazarov's room, which was already pervaded by a sort of medico-surgical odor, mingled with the smell of cheap tobacco.
After hearing Pavel's story, Bazarov is cynical. He ridicules any man who allows himself to be so dominated by a woman. He has absolutely no sympathy for this type of man. And so the important consideration is that both Pavel and Bazarov have a very similar type of experience with a very similar type of woman. That description of the princess that Pavel loved is quite similar to a character we're going to meet named Madame Odintsova. Wouldn't it be interesting if this very practical scientist found himself completely overwhelmed by romantic love for a woman? We will pick up with chapter 8.